Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll be starting here momentarily. Well, thank you so much for joining us for today's Pandas Prose. My name is Jenna Bonello, and I will be your host for today. Before we officially begin, I do just want to give a very special thank you to our WWF supporters and donors who are on this call. Our work would not be possible without you, so thank you so much to our WWF heroes. Your support means so much to us. And now just for a few logistics, this is a Zoom webinar, which means your cameras and mics have been turned off. They're on mute, but you are able to ask questions throughout via the chat feature. So please use that. We'll be getting to the audience Q&A portion towards the end of the program. And this is being recorded so that any family or friends who weren't able to join will be able to watch it on WWF's YouTube channel after. So I am joined today by Marcene Mitchell, WWF's Senior Vice President of Climate Change. Leading a multifaceted team to advance WWF's climate strategies, Marcene works with companies, financial institutions, and governments to scale new low-carbon areas through science-based targets in supply chain management, climate-smart agriculture, green cities, and forest regeneration. And Leah is here with us, Leah Thomas, to talk about her book, The Intersectional Environmentalist: How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet. You may know her as Green Girl Leah. I follow her on Insta, so that's how I know her. But Leah is a celebrated environmentalist who coined the term eco-communicator to describe her style of environmental activism. In 2020, she founded Intersectional Environmentalist, a leading resource hub for diverse and accessible climate education. And in 2022, she wrote her book, The Intersectional Environmentalist, which has been used in classrooms and for discussions like this around the world. Through her Green Girl Productions project, Leah has designed innovative programs like London's first Black Ecofeminist Summit and Earth Sessions, a community-driven climate justice concert series. And we're really excited for this conversation. It's going to be such a meaningful one. And so Marcene, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Jenna. And again, thank you so much, Leah, for joining us. It's really great to have you here with us for Pandas in Prose. Before we jump into questions about your book and intersectional environmentalism, why don't you catch us up a little bit about what you're doing, what your life is like these days, what keeps you busy? You describe yourself as an eco-communicator. So who are you communicating to? What's happening in the environment for you?
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me. This is so cool. The name is also lovely, Pandas in Prose. That's just like so cute. But what I'm up to lately, I'm working on another book that's all about women in the environment. So I'm really excited to take a deep dive into eco-womanism and ecofeminism. And then in addition to that, I'm also just experimenting with different ways to bring different folks to the climate conversation. So I've hosted over 20 Earth Sessions. Those are these climate concerts, and we typically work with R&B and hip hop artists to activate their communities. And yeah, I'm also just working on my personal blog and some other writings through Green Girl Leah. And that's what I've been up to.
That's great. And I love how you're bringing in different mediums. Like you're talking about concerts, which is, way we express ourselves musically and writing and, different ways of being able to connect with each other. And I think that's great. So thank you for that. We're looking forward to seeing more and more of that from you. So turning to the book. So in the book, your book, you emphasize the importance of recognizing the intersections between social justice and the environment and environmental issues, right? And you actually draw on the work of Kim Crenshaw, who's one of the, the founders of the idea of intersectionality, and the experience is a Black woman and our struggles in this country as the foundation of that intersectionality. So tell me, how does that translate to the environmental and the conservation sectors? And why is it important to address the environmental challenges of pollution, climate change, and biodiversity from an intersectional lens?
Yeah, so something I include in the book, there's a theory by the Kumbaya River Collective that inspired a lot of Kimberly Crenshaw's work. And they had a statement that said, if Black women were free, then everyone would be free because it would necessitate the destruction of like multiple systems. And we can expand on that even more for other, marginalized identities, etc. But I really believe in that instead of having a kind of top-down approach. If you actually create, environmental solutions or, different social justice solutions that start with the communities that are most impacted, then eventually it'll benefit everyone. And I also pull that from design. So there's something called the curb cut theory. So if you think about, those little curb cuts or little dips in the sidewalk, initially they were created for accessibility purposes, accessibility justice, and wheelchair users. However, I use that for so many different things, whether it's my shopping cart, my suitcase. Essentially, it made everyone's lives much easier. So that's another example of creating solutions, maybe starting with one community, but it ends up benefiting everyone. So I kind of take that approach when it comes to environmental justice. And I think we have a way better shot of getting all of the carbon out of the atmosphere if we can make sure people have food and water and a safe and healthy living environment.
Right. Well, I love that example because as you were saying that, I was thinking about how many times I too have used those curb cuts, right? And how important that is, and what a great analogy to lifting all ships by really focusing on those who have been historically excluded. So speaking of that, you explore the history of the environmental movement and how it has actually failed at many times to include or amplify the voices of these marginalized communities. And so often leaving, Black and brown and disabled and, LGBTQ communities behind. So what are some examples from the book that illustrate this kind of disconnect? And what are the most important changes that you think need to happen for the movement to become more inclusive and equitable?
Absolutely. And in the book, I love drawing from the past, but I wasn't there. So I'm sure there's a lot of people who could say, like, this is what the movement was actually like. And I was just, reading through research, but it was so strange for me to look at the 60s and 70s and see so much civil rights organizing, racial justice organizing, and then this huge Earth Day movement that activated millions of people around the world. And just wondering, okay, if we would have combined forces, and of course things are much more complicated than that, but when I saw these huge movements for both racial justice and civil rights and environmentalism happening, and then seeing an environmental justice movement that happened a couple decades later that didn't garner the support of a lot of the folks, the millions of people that participated in the first Earth Day movement, I started to wonder like what went wrong and if there was something that we could do to kind of unite those movements moving forward. And I think I was thinking about that because I wrote the book in 2020. And I also grew up right outside of Ferguson, Missouri. So saw a lot of racial justice organizing happening when I was in college. And at the same time, I was seeing all these environmental documentaries, a lot of my friends leaving school, participating in Fridays for Future. So I thought maybe we can learn from some of that momentum of the past and see if there are ways to kind of create, pathways for connection between these different movements, whether it's the Women's March or the movement for Black lives and racial justice, and just seeing how we could kind of combine those two things, which is complicated, but that's really
Yeah, right. Many different things to bring to board. But again, if you do it right from kind of the bottom up, then what your success is more. In fact, I'm going to channel my inner Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson here. And for those who don't know Dr. Johnson, she is a marine biologist. She's a fellow eco communicator. And just recently also put out a new book. And the heart of her book was really the question of, the future. How do we vision the future, right? So if we get this intersectionality right, you talked about it's complicated, right? You've got the environment and then you have all these other issues and you're trying to put them together. But if we actually did it right, what would that look like? What would like our success, how would that feel? How would that change people's lives? What do you think?
Ooh, it would feel so good. I'm trying to think about what that would look like. And I love that question, and just like radically imagining what the future would look like versus just, focusing on everything that's going wrong, because it's a nice, North Star to look to. But I think it would look like directly communicating with the communities that are most impacted and asking them, what do you need? Like, what are some of the things that you are seeing in your communities, connecting with the grassroots environmental groups that are already there and have identified the issues and just need funding and resources and support. So I think that perfect future would look a lot like wealth redistribution to grassroots organizations that, need support to address different environmental justice issues, and then making sure that people have their basic human environmental needs that should be rights met. So, access to a safe and healthy living environment, green spaces to recreate, um, water without lead and other harmful things, and access to clean air. And then hopefully like some land back as well, like returning the land to indigenous communities, or even returning the land to African American communities who had their land taken away from them, and hopefully repairing the earth one by one, like one step.
Well, that's a really beautiful vision, and I hope that when you have a vision, when you have something to kind of pull you right towards, I think it makes it much more powerful, and it actually helps you kind of sustain your energy, right? Because this is a long, it's a long path. It's not going to happen overnight, and so we need things to sustain us. I know that in the conservation area, in the past, I think often, conservationists would kind of like fly into areas that they felt needed to be conserved, and they would tell everyone, well, this needs to be conserved, and you guys need to move off this land, and this needs to be done here. But currently at WWF, we've really emphasized a community-led conservation, right, as a way of bringing solutions to bear, bringing the ancient wisdoms right to bear. A lot of these people have been conserving this land. They are the big conservers of this land, right? And so that wisdom that comes from them, is so important to incorporate versus kind of jumping in and saying this is the way to do it. But there are also issues of like capacity and access, and how do we get communities who haven't traditionally, been doing these type of things? How do we include them? So any thoughts that you've, from your reading, from your experience, about what are the things that are hallmarks of good practice when you're engaging marginalized communities without overwhelming them, without tapping in where everyone's just trying to get by and make a living and live their lives, and then they're asked to kind of solve the problems that have been caused for them, right? So what do you think about that? How do we help people, but in a way that's empathetic, that acknowledges where they're at, and their kind of day-to-day pressures and environment?
Yeah, I would say one thing would be to definitely like identify the people in the community that may have been, sorry, oh.
Your little cat.
But yeah, identify people or stakeholders in the community who know that the problems exist, because I think sometimes people might go into spaces with the savior type mentality of like, oh my gosh, these people, they don't know
Right.
what's happening to them, and let me save them. But there's a lot of people who are like, yeah, I think the water is really fishy. I would love another grocery store. Like I would love um, so really identifying, who those people are. So as an example, I live in Los Angeles now. And if we're talking about food insecurity or environmental injustice, or, food justice here, there's the Compton Community Garden. So there's a community garden right in the middle of Compton that has been doing everything they can to teach folks in the community through like a culturally competent lens about farming and gardening, and also getting food to the community. There's also a place called Supermarket, which is Black owned, that's specifically addressing those issues. So if someone, say, were to come into Los Angeles and without doing research, they might say, oh, there's no one who's addressing this food injustice that's happening here, which would be incorrect. And there might be community-based solutions that, again, just need resources, amplification, and support. So kind of survey who are the people, who are the organizations that are trying to address this, what issues are they facing? What is it that they need? And then seeing how you can plug in to help from there.
Right. So they need eco-communicators as part of one of the things. That amplification is really important, because a lot of times things are getting done and solutions are being brought, but people don't know about them, right? And then we fall back into this kind of like, oh, nothing is being done. And it's so important that we amplify these messages, right? And that they have the voices of people who are reflected in these communities. You know, a lot of things that I do is talk about climate solutions. And one of the most important things in climate, in terms of what we need to do, is really stop burning fossil fuels, right? That is, you know, 80% of what we're putting in the air and causing, you know, climate change is coming from us burning fossil fuels. And we burn it for everything, as you know. So it's not, it sounds good. Just don't burn it, right? Nice slogan, sounds good, but it's complicated because it's what we drive with. It's, you know, what heats our homes and what cools our homes. It's what we cook with, right? It's everywhere in our lives. And so it's hard, but we know that that's what we need to do. And in order to do that, we have to accelerate renewable energy, right? We have to build more wind and more solar. You know, we have to deploy these new technologies. And we can't address climate without this you know, idea of switching to renewable energy. However, and you talk about this in your book, that there are impacts of increasing renewable energy. We know that, and energy storage. So batteries for electric vehicles or batteries for the grid. They need minerals and different things like lithium and copper, and all of these minerals have to be mined. And we know historically in the fossil fuel era that we haven't done a great job in terms of, you know, mining these, that does have impact. So, and you talk about this in your book, but at the same time, we need to move more to this renewable energy. So let's talk a little bit about, like, how do we balance the need for renewable energy with the impacts? How do we move from, you know, our traditional way of just, you know, extracting, using, and then throwing things away? How do we move into kind of a more circular way? How do we have a lighter impact on the, you know, environment, as well as, you know, on the people? Because a lot of people live in these areas and they depend on these jobs, but we want to have it, make it useful for them without destroying our environment. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so this one is a really hard one sometimes to wrap my head around, because, you know, I drive a partially electric car and I definitely prefer electric vehicles and, you know, energy over gas. However, when I investigate, you know, what's going on with communities in Argentina and Chile and the Lithium Triangle, we're kind of seeing a similar pattern of, okay, these are primarily indigenous communities that are close to lithium mining, and a lot of people have, you know, said their concerns that they're having with their water quality. And another thing is a lot of communities aren't actually receiving a significant amount of monetary benefit. So it might be pennies and pennies. I remember a statistic that I put in the book. There was one community that received about $30,000 spread across all of the people, and they were extracting like so much lithium, like millions and millions and millions of dollars a week. So that's something to address. And then also making sure to continuously survey the community if they're finding issues with their water, their air quality, etc. Just making sure those things are being addressed, because I think when someone says, okay, this is a green energy project, this is great, sometimes the concerns are silenced. So I think, yeah, it all goes back to community investment, surveying the community, making sure that they are receiving some sort of benefit, especially if it's happening within indigenous lands. And yeah, that's what I talk about in the book. There's a couple other examples. There's one example of Mexico in particular. And again, there were a lot of folks and environmental activists that were facing serious harm because of the renewable energy. And it was like wind energy, and something that doesn't really feel very controversial at all. However, there are people in the community that were saying, okay, this wind farm in particular is actually having a negative impact on our air quality, or it's having a negative impact on this. Can we change a couple of things? And then they were met with violence. So I think
Oh,
having
dear.
systems in place where people can bring up their concerns, and also making sure that people are receiving some sort of monetary benefit.
Right. Yeah. So at WWF, we're about to release a paper in probably the beginning of the year where we look at all of, like, some of the key biodiversity areas, and we map it against where the expansion of mining would come from having to supply all this new renewable energy, right? And so having the information, because right now we often don't have the information of, like, where are some of the real conflict, places. And then working with local communities, with the industries, to try to do better, to do more of this circularity, to do less of this just extracting, and to give more benefit, as you point out, to the communities there, right? Often in these places, we just take the raw material away, don't give the communities an opportunity to build skills to have higher level production or manufacturing. They get the lowest level of things, or they get the lowest the greatest impacts without getting the benefits. So how do you get more benefits there? And the same thing, not only in this, often that happens in the developing world, but also even in this country, right? We're looking at how do we get more benefits to people in communities that are going to have to receive this, wind turbines or these solar panels, right? A lot of people feel like, oh, well, these are rural communities, and we're just putting these things in the rural communities, but it's really benefiting the folks in the city, right? So Montana says, why should we put, wind turbines here to benefit California, right? So, and you can understand that feeling. They're changing their environment for what they don't see as benefits right there. And it also happens with a lot of tribal communities who live in these areas in the central parts of our country. How do we make sure that they get, good benefits from all of this? So WWF is also working on a program about community benefits, and what does that look like? What does a good program look like of bringing in, so that the community feels like they're not just being sacrifice zones, but they're really getting something, and they're being part of a new movement that's really great. So wonderful. I'm going to finish up a couple questions, and then we have questions from the audience, which would be great. One of the things you have in your book is about the IE pledge, right? This Intersectional Environmental Pledge. So tell us a little bit about that. Who is the pledge for? What is it? What does that mean? And why make a pledge? What was your thinking about incorporating that throughout your book?
Yeah, I think as I approach 30 and this next phase of adulthood, it's so wild. I wrote that when I was I guess 25. So I it's just, I mean, it's just funny thinking of my younger self in that moment. I remember I was actually just like in my room on social media. And I just thought, okay, well, I'm talking about intersectional theory and environmentalism. There needs to be some sort of action step. I didn't just want to have like the way that I interpreted intersectional environmentalism and a definition of what it meant. I also wanted people to have something that they could kind of follow. And I was really inspired by Teresa Baker, who was also on the first IE Council when we started it. She had an outdoor CEO pledge, and I used to work in the outdoor industry at Patagonia for a couple of years. So I thought it was amazing that she gave all these CEOs at various outdoor brands kind of a set of guidelines to follow to really prioritize diversity and also environmental justice. So I thought, okay, I think people really pay attention to pledges. And again, I didn't want it to just be a social media post without some sort of action or framework. So I put that together, and it just came from the heart and what I thought maybe people should consider. I think looking back on 2020, there were a lot of Black and brown educators that were trying to tell people in their various sectors how they could get involved. So it just felt like a moment that I wanted to meet people with empathy, which is a word that you mentioned earlier, to say, okay, even if you didn't know about environmental justice before this day, it's okay, but you're going to learn about today, and here's what you can do to help. And just a tool to hold people accountable and also perhaps not overburden environmental justice leaders or racial justice leaders, and to kind of do some, you know, I think it was based on a lot of experiences that I'd had navigating the environmental space, whether
Yeah.
academia or corporate setting or nonprofit spaces, and I just kind of poured my heart out into it.
Okay, great. Well, I love that. And so people really check out Leah's book, The Intersectional Environmentalist, and see what that pledge is about and see if it resonates with you, right? Because it is personal and makes you feel, you know, more committed to these type of issues. Okay, so we want to start taking some questions from the audience. I see that we've put one question in the chat, so maybe should I start with that?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, Marcene. I think
Okay.
this question came from Vivian during your discussion about renewable energy versus fossil fuels and what that means for the future. So yeah, I'm happy to read it.
Go ahead.
So yeah, Vivian asked, what are your thoughts on AI technologies such as ChatGPT to accomplish climate resilient and actionable solutions for communities, knowing that AI tech uses so much energy?
It's a hard one. Let me jump in and then I'll turn it to Leah. So I think that's one of the points, right? Is that AI technologies really do, have a lot of energy demand. And so it's been very interesting. We've been talking to a lot of the tech firms who are our partners, such as like a Google or a Microsoft, et cetera. And they've been actually very climate forward. So these companies have been ones who have really made climate pledges about becoming, carbon neutral or even carbon positive, where they're, making up for past carbon emissions. And then AI came along, and suddenly all of that was kind of blown out of the water. They were not able to make their goals. And so we're seeing, I don't know if you've seen recently in the press that Microsoft is investing in, restarting 3 Mile Island nuclear facilities. They're turning to nuclear because they feel like they can get, energy quickly. I think it's probably very expensive energy, and obviously there are a lot of environmental issues of the nuclear industry that they may not have answered, but they're doing this so they can continue to meet their climate pledges while we'll go in. And this is kind of what we were talking about, Leah, where you have, okay, nuclear is carbon free, right? So that's good because we have to have carbon free technologies, but what are the environmental and social impacts of that? So I think that's one question. I also think, again, everything is complicated, that AI technologies can help us. So we have a program at WWF called Manglaria, which means AI for mangroves in Spanish, right? And so what we're doing, mangroves, for those who don't know, are kind of the forests that are between the ocean and the land. And they're great. They're real climate heroes. Okay. They both help for resilience, meaning they stop storm surges and they, help protect folks inland. They also absorb lots of emissions, much more than even tropical forests. So they're great. And they are, become the fishery nurseries, and they're really wonderful things, but they're very temperamental, right? And so we're using AI to collect a ton of data. We collect a ton of data about them, and then we analyze it with AI, and it helps people know where to plant them, what kind of mangroves to plant, how they can help the farmers, and then the people in the area are also able to use all this technology that we're doing about, how salty the seawater is, when the storms are coming. And so they're able to benefit from this, locally as well as around the mangrove project. So, there are pluses and minuses. I think that it's a good thing. I think we need to take it carefully and make sure that as we are walking into this new area, that we're not really hurting our environment by being so quick to get energy in ways that we may or may not, come to regret. So. But Leah, do you have any thoughts on top of that?
It was honestly so beautifully said. So, other thoughts beyond that, but I think it would be lovely to see like some sort of ethical AI guide. I don't know if that's something that you all have done or other environmental organizations, because I have a lot of questions as well. So it would be great to have, whether it's a coalition of environmental organizations come together and say like, okay, here's a guideline of ethical AI, and kind of breaking down some of these things, like the good things, the not so great things. But I think AI is definitely going to change our world in a lot of ways that are hard for me to even comprehend as a writer. Even our industry is shifting, communications is shifting because of AI. So just hoping that we can have some guidelines to keep it as ethical and empathetic as possible.
That's such a great idea, Leah. I could definitely, someone who's in the environmental space, right? A very novice AI user, adopter, could benefit greatly from something like that. So good idea. All right, we just have a couple more audience questions here before we close things out. But Tara asks if you could tell us about a situation or issue that inspired you to see environmental solutions through an intersectional lens. Leah, I know you talk a lot about, your background, having really strong women in your life that have guided you through this work. But just for both of you, if there is a point or a moment in your life that really speaks to you, would love to hear it.
Yeah, there's been a couple, but I think one was I lived in rural Kansas for about 3 months as a park ranger intern with the National Park Service. And I was at a National Historic Site called Nicodemus National Historic Site. We usually got like 0 to 2 visitors a day, so very, very small town of under 500 people. But Nicodemus is the first town west of the Mississippi that African Americans went to and kind of created their own town after slavery. So when I was there, it was just such beautiful environmental history that met Black history. And then I started realizing, and it really opened my eyes to just how many stories of various cultures of people are out there and quite literally buried in the soil. So, they had dugouts in the soil, and before they had homes, and there were so many artifacts and just things to look at. And it really inspired me because I went there the summer after the Ferguson uprisings, and it just felt really healing to see myself kind of reflected in environmental history. And I think those positive stories are what really motivate me to also look at the not so positive things happening with environmental injustice, but kind of uncovering those special stories, I think really clicked for me. And that's why I feel like I see my work kind of in 2 areas, the environmental injustice and the hazards and those sorts of things, and also just the beautiful, diverse, true environmental history, and just getting to share that with as many students as I can.
That's great. For me, it's a little different kind of intersectionality. So my career path really was founded in working to reduce poverty in the global South. So I was a development finance person, and I was working in Latin America and in the Andean region where the glaciers were melting faster than any place else in the world. And I saw that the people on the, who were living, the indigenous people on the land, were really suffering because suddenly you had different kind of water flows. The coast was taking their water. They were really living on the land, and they had done so well, and we worked so hard in terms of raising people out of poverty. And with this climate and environmental area, people were falling back into poverty, right? And I realized that if we didn't really address some of these environmental issues, we were never going to be able to address these issues of poverty and development, right? That's that kind of intersectionality where you can't just look at things in one kind of bucket. I think this is what Leah's been talking about, that if you look at the experiences of those who are like closest to the land or at the bottom of the pole, and you say, what do we need to do for them? It quickly raises you up into these issues of like, how do we address our environment? How do we address our climate? And so that's kind of how my experience with intersectionality. And from that, as I said, I was doing development finance, and I came back and I said, I have to do climate change. I have to work on this bigger issue, because without this, we'll never, reach all of our goals.
Thank you for sharing that. I love hearing the two different perspectives and entry points, right? It just shows that regardless of where you come from or how you got there, this work is so important. And there really is an entry point for everyone. And that actually leads us really nicely into our last question. So I know we have a lot of members. So WWF has employee resource groups, and we have a lot of folks from our Eco Network one, so early career environmentalists on the call. And Francesca let us know that they've selected Intersectional Environmentalist as the book for their next book club. So I'm so excited for them to dive into this if they haven't already before this discussion. And so, Leah, I know in the book you have so many resources out there, suggestions for additional reading, people to follow. But Francesca was wondering if you have suggestions for the group as they start their discussion on how best to amplify the work of intersectional environmentalist leaders and how to advocate for the book's key themes in their everyday lives.
Oh, that's so exciting. I think one thing would be, so intersectional environmentalist. We have a new executive director, which I'm really excited about, and the organization is really focusing on being a movement connector. So we have a database of about 500 environmental equity focused organizations in the United States, and that list is growing. So I would say the number one thing that I would tell people who are interested in being an intersectional environmentalist, and I know I've said it a lot, but it's because I think it's so important, is just to find your local EJ org. Find an organization in your community that focuses on the intersection of, identity or social issues and environmentalism, whether that's food justice, whether that's water access, honestly, whatever it is, even if it's a fashion organization that focuses on, ethics and environmentalism at the same time, just identify those organizations. So, a couple, even if there's just three grassroots organizations that you advocate for, and just kind of mention casually in conversation or share their stories on your Instagram story, that really goes a long way. So I would say really get familiar with your local EJ org. In addition to that, I would say making sure to pair your work similarly to what I said earlier with environmental injustice, and then also the positive solutions and things that are happening. So we have over $1 billion in funding for the first time specifically for environmental justice and other, equity focused environmental things. So sharing those wins, there have been people working since the 80s to get that kind of funding for environmental justice. And I'm so excited to see how that could potentially transform communities. So make sure you also hold those kind of success stories, because that's what helps me keep going. And I think it also motivates other people to want to be involved if you let them know, like, hey, there's actually a lot of momentum and we're in this environmental justice renaissance, and we just got to keep it up and make sure that, resources get to people. So that's some advice.
Right. And Jenna, before we go, there was one question we missed in the chat that I think is really important for both of us to answer. And it was about the idea of encountering pushback for the work that we're doing, right? That there are people who may not be willing to talk about climate change or environmental justice, and how, especially in this very divided country, right? And so how do you deal with that? How do we do that? And so I think in climate change, it's so important that we have those conversations and we really listen to people and where they are coming from, and try to find the points of commonality. I mean, we are told so much how far apart we are, and in some ways we are, but there are often ways that you can find a commonality with someone, something that they care about that also you care about for the climate. So for example, say you're in rural Iowa and people are concerned about like putting solar panels in their farms. Well, what they may really be concerned about is having a way of keeping their children still in the rural environment. They like that lifestyle. They want to continue that lifestyle. They want to be stewards of the land. But they don't want their children all to move to the city. So maybe this is a way of being able to say, well, some of the benefit could be that you could still have this rural lifestyle. You could still farm your land, but part of it could be used to do the solar, which will have jobs, which will allow you to pay for the some of the farming income, which will allow your kids to stay close to home. I mean, it's listening listening in a different way in terms of what people care about and trying to make those connections with the things that you and I care about. So that's just one way of kind of dealing with it. But I know, Leah, not everybody feels like this idea of intersectionality is good. Obviously, we've been seeing books pulled from schools and lots of controversy, and even with the environmental justice area. So how do you react to that? How do you deal with that?
I mean, it's frustrating, but I feel like you can say the same thing in different ways. And that's the beauty of communications and why we need more environmental communicators, because I never want the language that I'm using to be one, like a barrier of entry for someone to the environmental space. So I don't live by the notion that it's like dumbing down information. I've heard some academics say that, when really it's just making information as accessible as possible, because I see nothing more urgent than making sure that we can act on climate. So if I'm conversating with someone that maybe can see wealth inequality, but maybe doesn't believe in other forms of inequality, like, okay, in this moment, maybe I should talk to this person about their concerns about economics and wealth inequality and how it's impacting their family and what that has to do with environmentalism. Or if I'm talking to, a rural community that's being impacted by like fracking fluid, or is really struggling because of a previous loss of industry and is just trying to find a way to feed their families. So it's not necessarily that they love oil or they love mining, but they just want to feel empowered and maybe feel, misunderstood, and really just trying to come to it with an empathetic perspective and just hear again, like, what are some of the concerns that you're having? Because I've never, thank goodness, met someone who seriously thought, well, they're out there, but destroying the earth was a great thing, or that we should continue doing all these terrible things. It's usually connected to someone's livelihood in one way, shape, or form, or fear that if we stop doing things that way, like, what does that mean for the country? What does that mean for their family, etc. So really just trying to get to the heart of it, making the information as accessible as possible. You can say the same things in a lot of ways, like instead of intersectional environmentalism or a 12-syllable, combination of words, I can say, I think it's important to protect people and planet. I really want everybody to have clean air, clean water. There's like 40% of us. Like if you break down some of the statistics, if you talk about African Americans, a couple years ago, it was, I think, 71% of African Americans lived in a county that frequently violated air quality standards. But for everybody, it was around 30 or 40%. So that means everyone in the United States, 30 to 40% of people are living in these areas. So sometimes I will, use really inclusive statistics so people can find themselves, reflected in the data.
Yeah, thank you both for that so much. I think it's, we want to end on a hopeful note, right? And sometimes that can be hard, right, where we are right now. But, I think to your point, Leah, right, just having conversations with people at the end of the day, right? People just need clean water, fresh air, and to make their children happy and, go about their lives. So, yeah, well, thank you both so much for this really thoughtful conversation. It's been so lovely to have you. We have some really awesome comments in the chat, great insights. Thank you all. As I said at the beginning, we'll be posting this recording to World Wildlife Fund's YouTube page and sharing it out on social media. So we hope you'll tune in after. But thank you so much, and we'll connect up soon.
Great. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.